Hello, I'm Renee Boston. I am one of the birth injury and medical malpractice attorneys practicing law here in the state of Maryland. And I want to talk to you today about some issues that are pertaining to the COVID-19 situation. So we have a special guest with us today. Attorney Lucrecia Johnson has joined us, and she's going to give us kind of a snapshot as to what landlords and tenants can expect during this shelter-in-place situation. So let me give you a little bit of a primer about Attorney Lucrecia Johnson. She is the owner and operator of LPJ Legal. She practices law in Maryland as well as in DC. And she's going to talk a little bit about both the landlord-tenant aspects from both Maryland and DC. In addition to those matters, she also handles in her practice real estate and construction law, business law, as well as educational law. So at the end of this video, we're going to include Attorney Johnson's website and her information so you can have access to that as well. And also her email address if you need to reach out and ask her any further questions, or if you need to retain her services if you have any other further questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Attorney Lucrecia Johnson. Thank you very much, Attorney Johnson, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, and happy birthday, Mrs. Boston.
Thank you. I'm 18 again. Don't tell nobody.
And you do not look a day over it, ma'am. Yeah.
Let me tuck in the grays. Okay. So thank you very much, Attorney Johnson, for gracing us with your presence on this shelter-in-place type of day. I know you still got work to do because everybody's working from home like we're doing right now. So I thank you very much for your time. So I want to just kind of jump right into it and talk about a situation. So, you know, most people are sheltered in place. Some are still working. The essential people are still working, nurses, doctors, and some food service and grocery and mail and stuff like that. But what about for the majority of Americans, or majority of people, we're going to concentrate to DC and Maryland. So a majority of people in this area are under a shelter-in-place order and are not allowed to return to their regular jobs. So some people may not be receiving that weekly, bi-weekly, whatever paycheck that they've been used to getting, and they may be in a situation where they're kind of at a crossroads with paying their rent. What kind of advice do you have for a tenant in this situation who cannot pay their rent?
So the first advice I have essentially is to communicate. If you're a tenant that you know you will not be able to make your May's rent, or you can't make this rent, you want to communicate with your landlord and let them know that, hey, due to the shutdowns and the shelters in place with COVID, I won't be able to make my rent this month. And give them essentially your plan.
Okay. So let's flip it from the perspective of the landlord situation. What can a landlord do, or what should a landlord expect during this time as well?
So first, the landlord needs to be aware of the current changes that the different states have put into place due to COVID right now. The second thing is, once they know those changes, they want to try to be just human. Understand that this is an unprecedented event for most people. This is not something that anyone is used to. And so they want to remember that if there is essentially a way for them to, make sure that the tenant is able to continue to live in the space, that they should do that. Right now, they can't actually evict anyone in Maryland or DC. So once the courts reopen, though, you want to think about whether it's beneficial to you or not to actually file for that eviction.
Okay. So what in this situation, let me give you a scenario. What if the tenant is actually paying their rent right now, but they've learned that the landlord is not turning around and paying the mortgage?
Okay, so this is where it becomes important of being sure that you vote for the right people. So in Maryland, because it's a court order that stated that there's essentially a halt to evictions and foreclosures, and that came from the court, your legislators didn't actually make any changes. In DC, however, the council included in their emergency bill about COVID that if the landlord is not paying their mortgage, if their mortgage is deferred, then essentially they can't collect the rent for that either, including any penalties associated with it. So when the courts reopen, there's a chance that you can make that same argument, but then you are at the mercy of the judge in Maryland to decide that, whereas in DC it's an automatic.
Okay. So I actually, when I was out earlier today, just kind of walking around the block, getting some fresh air, I saw people were moving and they had stuff loaded into two different cars and they were just kind of packing it all in. What happens if a tenant's lease expires during the shelter in place? If they have to stay in the property, because I think Maryland, I think in Maryland it is an automatic lease renewal or of some sort, whether it's month to month or a new term, but there's an automatic lease renewal. So what happens in that situation where your lease expires during the COVID-19 shelter in place?
So this is where you want to pull out your lease and see what it says. Some leases state that you have an automatic, if you don't renew the lease, it automatically goes month to month and it's going to stay at the same amount that you're paying for rent now. Or it could say that it'll automatically go month to month but your rent will increase by this amount. However, what you want to specifically look for is the holdover tenant clause. If there's a clause that says holdover tenant or anything similar to that, you want to pay special attention to that, because likely what that is going to do is double your rent. Like it's going to be a significant increase. And the point of that is to incentivize people to re-sign a full-term lease.
Gotcha.
So people really only want to use that clause if they know they're going to be there just for another month. However, in this times of uncertainty, you don't know how long before you'll be able to move, and you don't want to be spending extra money.
Right.
Um, in DC right now, though, the good news is that there cannot be any rent increases. So if you have that clause, this is the same legislation that halted the evictions and foreclosures.
Okay.
They can't increase your rent. However, in Maryland, to my knowledge, nothing like that has been put into place. So if you have already given your notice and you decide to be a holdover, you could be liable for paying that increased rent amount.
Okay. Wow, didn't know that. All right, so let me ask you this too. So we do a lot of work on behalf of children and families, or a lot of our children are special needs children. They have medical issues. So at this time, when people are kind of all in one place, now you've got everybody at home in an apartment building or an apartment complex, and there's a lot more people around each other. I know the weather here hasn't been that great lately, and people are now smoking indoors, whether it's other stuff, and whether it's cigarettes or cigars or whatever, what kind of advice can you give, let's say for our regular clients, the parents of the children with special needs that have asthma and other breathing problems on breathing treatment, things like that? What advice can you give families in that situation who don't want the smokers, next door to them smoking against the wall, coming through the exhaust system or whatever? So is there any piece of advice that you can give to those people?
Yes. So I'm really big on communication. So the very first thing that they can definitely do is just walk over, knock on the neighbor's door, explain, listen, I have a child that has certain medical issues and the smoke is really a problem for them. So if you don't mind, if you could continue with the building's rules and go outside and smoke so that it's not coming in. We know that everyone is not as nice. They may not be
Right.
amenable to doing that once you ask.
Right.
What you would still want to do then is then just report it to the landlord or the property manager like you normally would. The problem here is, though, that since there's a halt on evictions, the landlord is limited to essentially just fining the tenant. Remember how I stated that in DC, you can't increase rent and you can't do the fees and all that.
Right.
Well, this would be a situation where arguably you can still fine. Those fines will still be rolling
Okay.
and become part of their rent like usual. And in Maryland, of course, you can still do it. They are still allowing what they call emergency evictions, but I'm not sure that the smoke will rise to the level of an emergency eviction. What is more, one is something that's very clear and present danger. Like if you have a partner and your partner is violent, whether you're
Okay.
both on the lease, okay, the partner needs to be evicted. So
Okay. All right. So that's actually kind of all the big topics that I wanted to cover today. Is there anything that we missed, or anything that you want to kind of share on the perspective of from the side of the tenant right now, or the landlord, that can kind of, I guess, kind of smooth the waters during the COVID-19 situation and make everything kind of keep going, or run as smooth as possible until the situation is over?
Sure. To my landlords, I simply state that you want to be human. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. Right now, through legislation or either through the banks acting on their own and the mortgage services, most people can defer their mortgage right now. So if you have a property that you depend on the rent to pay that mortgage and you can defer it, then defer it. You also want to keep in mind that you're still going to need tenants after this. And so if this is a particular tenant that you've had that has always consistently paid their rent, why would you cause them harm now when they can't pay due to absolutely no fault of their own? Um, if they've always paid, then the minute they can pay, they're going to start back paying again.
Right.
So keep that in mind. The only time that I suggest that you reach out to legal counsel and get advice, or maybe have a consultation, is if you have a tenant as to what they call habitually late. Habitually late tenants, you get more leeway in evicting them faster and having certain penalties. And by habitually late is someone who, for the last 6 months of their lease, they haven't paid rent on time. So this has nothing to do with COVID. They just don't pay their rent timely.
Mm-hmm.
If you fail to file for them, you could be giving up some rights when it comes to habitually being able to file for eviction for habitually late. So even though if you file right now in Maryland, the eviction will automatically be stayed, you may still need to file for a habitually late tenant to keep that option open for yourself. Um, I For the tenants, I just want you to know that essentially you have rights. There has been information in the news about some landlords specifically requesting sexual favors for
Oh, wow.
tenants that can't pay.
Okay.
Um, you obviously don't have to do that. That would be improper at any given time. But the
But that goes on.
Yes. So I just learned last year that this is actually so common that there's a section in HUD that focuses solely on this. There's a hotline that you can call and report it. In the past, where it happens most frequently is for maintenance requests, things that the landlord is supposed to be fixing anyway. They say, well, okay, I'll come take a look at your pipe if you.
Look at my pipe.
Yes. And so this has apparently been an ongoing issue, and especially for some of the more at-risk individuals in the communities. Um, they cannot evict you right now, regardless of whether or not it's going to be stayed or they actually can't do it for non-payment in this point in time. You will continue to have a roof over your head, likewise utilities, because no utilities can be disconnected at this time.
Okay. So it seems like the gist of everything is stay in communication, whether it's the tenant reaching out to the landlord or the landlord kind of keeping the tenant kind of abreast of what's going on. But let me ask you this. So what happens in a situation where I have a building that I'm renting for my business in Maryland? Will that change, or will the rules kind of be similar to that?
Yeah, so again, this goes back to the legislation in DC. It does change because there are so many businesses have to be closed because they're not considered essential. DC wrote in their legislation that commercial tenants' rent has to either be deferred or reduced, which is unheard of. Typically, in commercial leases, the contract controls.
Right.
So you don't have a lot of protections in the law. In Maryland, essentially, we don't know because there has not been any legislation. There has not been, of course, a court order. A court order is tolling the and preventing the evictions, but that doesn't mean that the minute they open back up as a commercial tenant, that the court won't order that you have to be removed from the property. To be proactive, if I was a tenant of a commercial lease, you want to pull out your lease, you want to take a look and um, the look at a particular section that states that if basically things start to shut down due to no fault of your own, like it's usually acts of God, acts of war, and things of that sort. You want to look for that to see whether or not a pandemic is covered, whether or not an emergency order is covered. And even if it's not, either way, then you want to call your commercial landlord and say to them, hey, I have a restaurant. I can't, of course, my business is slower now. Even if I'm still doing to-go orders, everything else is slow. So I am asking you to, let's just extend my lease, meaning that I don't have the money to pay these 3 months, but we extend the lease by 3 months and I pay then.
Okay. So I think that's the big thing, is keeping that line of communication open, whether it's commercial or private or public housing or whatever it is, just kind of keeping communication with the other party and let them know, this is my situation, this is what's going on.
Yes.
All right. Well, I thank you kindly, very, 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 very much, Attorney Lucrecia Johnson. And again, this is Attorney Lucrecia Johnson of LPJ Legal. Her information is going to be included with this video. And that way, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to her. Her email address will be there. If you want to consult with her, if you want to retain her services, she will be available. I don't know, you got to have your money right, though. But she'll be available to talk to you about your situation. Again, she practices in real estate and construction law, business law, as well as education law. So thank you very much, Attorney. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. Again, I'm Renee Boston. I'm one of the attorneys at Boston Law Group LLC. We practice birth injury and medical malpractice. I thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.